Hi there, I'm Eitan, and welcome back to the Wix Wiz. This is the second video in our custom cart series, and in this part we are going to be finishing up the repeater that displays our line items, and we're going to be tackling a few things, among them changing the currency code into a currency symbol like you see right over here. We're also going to be explaining how to display our product options here in a text element, and how to do more interactive things like change the quantity of the line item in the cart by using these buttons. So plus would add, minus subtract, and to change the value right over there. And last but not least, how to go ahead and completely remove one of these items from the cart by clicking the remove button. So if you want to learn how to do all that and more, let's get started. Okay, so before we hop in and start writing any code, I just want to do a short recap of what we did last time. So last time in the first episode of this series, we set up this repeater, which essentially shows the products that are currently in the cart. And we set it up so that we have the image being displayed, we have the product name, the individual unit price, we have the quantity being displayed over here, and we have a preliminary display of the total price for all of the units. But there are some fixes that we wanted to do here. For example, we still want to be able to display this currency using a symbol and not using the currency code as it is right now. We also haven't displayed our product options yet, and we also want to give the capabilities to change the quantity of the product by clicking either plus, minus, or actually changing the number here in the input. And we also want to give the option to completely remove this product from the cart using this X button over here. So essentially all the functionality that we would typically have in the standard Wix cart. So we're going to hop in, and that's what we're going to be doing today. So the first thing I'm going to start with is with the currency symbol. And that's because it's the most simple thing to fix, and we're going to be using an npm package for that. Essentially, we just need some kind of source that will tell us what the specific symbol is for a specific code. And this is just the npm package that I personally chose because I've used it before, but you can also go shopping and find something that works better for you. You can even just make your own JSON object with all of the codes and the symbols. The advantage theoretically of using an npm package would be that if it's upkept, then if for some reason a code changed or a symbol changed or something like that, then the package would be updated as well, and you wouldn't need to personally maintain those changes. So that's kind of why I choose to go with a package. And the package that I'm going with here is this currency symbol map package. And to use it, all we'll have to do is go to our editor and then head right over here to packages and apps, and then click over here to install a package from npm. And I'm just going to search for it by name. So currency map symbol map. And as you can see, like there are obviously many packages doing something quite similar, and there might even be one that's a little better or same. So yeah, don't take my word for it, but if you want to go with something that's been tested, then you can go with this one. So I'm going to go ahead and click install. And the way that we're going to use this package is that we are going to use essentially this function over here. So get symbol from currency, and then all we need to do is pass in the code, and we should be able to get the symbol. So once this installs, all I need to do is import this function from the package here at the top level. So now that it's installed, I can just copy this line of code and put it right up here on top above my get cart. And what I'm going to do is that essentially once we get the cart from get cart and we get this currency, which if you recall, this currency right over here is going to be the currency code. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to get the symbol and store it as a global variable. So let's do that right over here. So I'll declare here let currency, let me zoom in so you can see what I'm actually doing. So let currency symbol equal, well, essentially it'll be undefined initially. And then later on here, when I actually get the currency from the cart, I will say here that our currency symbol should be equal to, and then we're going to be using this function right over here, so get symbol from currency, and we're going to pass in, right over here, we're going to pass in the currency. And then the last change that we need to make here is that here, instead of using the currency itself, we're going to use the currency symbol. Okay, so if I go ahead and publish this, and we take a look at it here on the live site. So I'm going to go here and just give this a refresh. And now you can see that here, instead of having the currency code, we now have the currency symbol, and I can use this in other places also throughout the cart if necessary. Okay, so that was the first easy fix, and now that we've done that, we'll head over to formatting the product options. Okay, so before we format the product options, we need to understand essentially what the data structure is of those options so that we can convert it into plain text for our text field. So in order to do that, what I've done is I've added a log here inside of our code that will essentially log the cart once we get it. And now you can see here that on the live site, I have this cart object inside of our console logs. And if I take a peek into this cart, and specifically into the line items, then you can see here that each of the line items has something called the catalog reference. Okay, and this has information about the catalog item, which I don't want to go too deep into because it has to do with the whole shift between Wix stores to Wix ecom, which is supposed to facilitate kind of more situations than just Wix stores. But the thing that we need to take a look at here within the catalog reference is specifically these options, okay? Because these are the options of the product. And you can see here that my first product doesn't have any options, but this still gives us valuable information because it tells me that even if there are no options, essentially we'll just have an empty object here for options. Okay, so that's something important to know because if I didn't know that, then I might write code that would count on the fact that these options don't exist at all for a product without options. But now that I know that this does exist, we'll have to think of how we're going to create a condition that won't display these product options in a case where this options object essentially is empty. So that's something to think about a little later on. And if we scroll down a little bit, then we can see here that within the catalog reference, here for the options, we do have one option, and that is color white. Okay, so essentially our goal is going to be to take these options and display them here as plain text in product options. Okay, so back in the editor, I'm going to now create a function that will facilitate that conversion between an object to plain text that we can put inside of our text element. So I'm going to go ahead right over here under my populate cart items function, and I'm going to zoom in and say function convert product options to text. Okay, that's going to be the name of our function. And what it's going to take here as a parameter is a product, which essentially corresponds here to item data from our repeater on ready. And I see here that I have a typo product. There we go. So once we have a specific product, let's think about what we need to do here. So if we head back over here, then we can see that these product options essentially sit under the product, catalog reference, and then we have options. So I'm going to say here that const options equals to product dot catalog reference dot options. Okay, and then once we have these options, so now currently it's in an object format, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to extract the keys from that object. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say const keys, equals to object dot keys and the options object. So essentially what this is going to do is it's going to create an array here in keys where each item is essentially one of the options for my product. So like size, color, etc. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a string or text. So I'll call this options text, and I'll have it as an empty string to begin with. And then what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to essentially loop through our keys and add in the key and value pairs from the object. So let's see how we're going to do this. So I'm going to say here for let I equal 0. What did I do wrong here? Okay, I don't know why I was. I don't even know what the mistake that I made was, but now it seems to be working. Let I equal 0. I is smaller than keys dot length and I plus plus. So a very simple loop. I'll have to rewind the footage to see why it was throwing me that syntax error over there. Um, and so as we loop through this, what we're going to say is that options text equals to options text plus, and then we're going to create a new string. So here we're going to have the key I. Okay, so this is going to be, keys I. So this is going to be the current key that we're on. And then we're also going to have colon and space. And then here we'll have the options. Let me make sure you can see what I'm doing here. Keys. Options, keys, I. Okay, so here, let's say if we have keys, let's say that keys is like, it's an array with, size and color, etc. So essentially what this is going to do is going to loop through, and it's going to say that options text should be whatever we've already added to options text, and then it should add one of these keys, so let's say size, and then it should add the option that corresponds to this specific key from our option. So let's say size large. So this will be large over here. And the last thing that I want to do here is that I want to escape to a new line. So I don't want these all to be one after the other. I just want them to be line after line. So in order to do that, we're going to add here \n. Okay, and that's how we tell it essentially to add a new line there. So it won't actually write \n, it'll actually just create a new line in the text. Okay, and then once we've looped through all of that, what we're going to do here at the end of our function is we're going to return the options text. Okay, and then what we'll do here, the last thing that we need to do is essentially call this function within our onItemReady. So I'm going to go right over here to the bottom. So I'm here within the populate cart items function, and I'm here within the onItemReady for the line item repeater. And I'm going to go here to the last line, and I can zoom back in here, and I'm going to say that item and product options dot text equals to, and here we get to call the function that we labored so hard on, so that's convert product options to text, and here we're going to pass in the item data, which is essentially the product. Okay, so cross your fingers. Now is the time to test. So let me go ahead and zoom back out. I'm going to publish this change, and let's head over to the live site and give this a refresh and see what this looks like. Awesome. So you can see here that it says color white. And if you recall before, I made this huge deal about about what will happen if our options doesn't have anything in it and we have to think about it. So apparently we didn't need to think as hard as I thought. And that makes kind of sense because if we take a look here, we can see that essentially what will happen is that if there are no options, then this keys array will be, the length will be 0. So essentially we'll never enter the loop and we'll just end up returning an empty string that we declared over here for the options text. Okay, so that also covers the case where there are no options. So we got all our bases covered over there. And what I'll do now is I'll head into the store, the shop, and I'm going to try and look for a product that has two options. I'm going to add it to the cart so we can just make sure that it's working as I expected for a product that has more than one option. Okay, so here I am back, and I've added this product that you can see over here on the bottom to the cart. And as you can see here, this one has two different options and it's displaying as expected. So we see here that size and color, each one is on its own line, and it looks pretty good. Obviously, you can, I'm assuming you're doing your own design, so you can decide how exactly you want to display these things. You might have a completely different vision for how you display the selected options, but at least now you have a tool in order to display them how you want. So now that we've done that, we're going to head over to talking about how to change the quantity of the product inside of the cart. So now what we're going to be doing is we are going to be changing the quantity of a specific line item in the cart using this setup that we have over here. So pretty standard, when you click the plus button, it should increment by 1. Click the minus button, it should decrement by 1. And if you input a specific number here, then it will change the quantity to that specific number. So that's what we're trying to achieve. And this is going to be done using this update current update current cart line item quantity API, which is part of current cart, which is part of Wix ecom backend. Okay, and the way that it works essentially is that we import the current cart from our from the package, and then right over here, I don't know how well you can see this, but essentially what we need to do is we need to, there we go. We need to call this function and pass in these line items, but these aren't the full line items. It's essentially just the ID of a specific line item and the quantity that we want to change it to. And note here that it needs to be 1 or higher, which makes sense because if it's 0, that's essentially the same thing as removing it from the cart. Okay, so that's something we're also going to want to deal with on the front end. But first we should start with setting up this function on the back end. So I'm going to go back here into the editor, and specifically I'm going to go to this cart.jsw file, which we already created in the back end. And this is where I'm going to write the function which will change the quantity. So let me go ahead and create a new function here, and it's going to be export async function, and I'll call this change item quantity. And what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be building this in a way that you only pass in one line item. If you recall from what I showed you in the documentation, you have the option to pass in an array of line items. But since we built our cart that you can only update one line item at a time, our backend function really only needs to facilitate that at the moment. And I also have my fingers crossed that we don't have to pass in any line items that we didn't make changes to, even though I didn't see any specific reference to that in the documentation. So what I'm going to do here is for the parameter, I'm going to set this to be, instead of line items, I'm just going to say that this is going to be the line item. Okay, I could have also split it up and said it will have one parameter, let's say for ID, and another parameter for the actual quantity, but we can pass it all in as an object. It's best to have as few parameters as possible for a function if you can. So I'm just going to have this as line item. And here what we're going to do is we're going to call that API. So I'm going to say const updated line items equals to await current cart. And here we're going to call it. So I'm going to say dot update current cart line item quantity. And here I'm going to pass in an array, which is going to have just our one line item. Okay, so I'm essentially wrapping that single object line item that we pass into the function in an array so that it fits with what the API is expecting, which is an array. And after we got that, we can return the updated line items. Okay, just so that we can have some kind of confirmation on the front end that our line items have been updated. And we can even use this data to make that update so we have the official data coming back from the API, and we know that we're definitely displaying the user the correct value for the quantity. Okay, so now that we're done building out that function, essentially what we can do is import this function on the front end and update the quantity of our items from the front end. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So let me grab the name of this function. I'm just going to copy it, head over to our custom cart page, and import it over here along with the get cart, which is imported from the same file. So now that I've put that over there, what we're going to do is we're going to hop into the on item ready for the repeater, and we're going to add the event listeners for the buttons and for the input. So let's start off with the add button. So I'm going to go over here to the bottom of the on item ready. Let me zoom on in, and let's select the add quantity button, and I'm going to say dot on click, and we're going to have a callback function here. And inside of this callback function, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to extract the ID and the quantity from our line item. So that's going to be the item data. Okay. And then what we're going to want to do is we're going to increment this quantity by 1. So I'm going to say const updated quantity equals to quantity plus 1. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call the function that we built out in the backend. So I'm going to say const updated line items equals 2. And remember that this is an asynchronous function. So we're going to need to use the await keyword over here. And we're also going to need to turn this callback function into asynchronous. And here we get to call our change item quantity. And this needs to be passed in an object. And it's going to have the ID. And it's going to have the quantity, which is essentially the updated quantity. Okay? And after we do that, I'm just going to add in here a log, console.log, updated line items. Okay, and this is just for testing purposes, updated line items. And there are still a few things that I want to do here after we get back our updated line items, but I feel like this is a good point to actually test our code and see if we have any bugs and work through them before we take another step further. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to publish these changes. And I'm going to head back over here to our cart. I'm going to refresh the page. Okay, so our cart has loaded. And now let's try clicking on one of the plus buttons over here. So let's say I'll try and increment this second product over here. So I click the plus button and I see that it ran 3 times. So that means that I probably accidentally wrote here $W instead of $item. And yeah, so if that happened to you too, you can take a shot. No. It'll happen at least once per repeater use from my experience, that you use the $W instead of the $item. So don't feel too bad if that happened to you as well. And now I'm going to just publish that. And I'm going to refresh the card here. And since it did seem to work, so here we see that you can see that it was incremented by 1 over here for this product. Okay, so it did work even though it ran for all of the items accidentally. But let's try it again just for this one item here. And it ran it for all 3 again. Maybe I'm not looking at the updated version of the site, so we need to publish few times. Sorry, refresh the page a few times. Let me try again. There we go. Okay, so it only ran once, which is great. And we can see here that essentially it passed back this object with cart over here. And inside, we actually have all of the cart information. Okay, so not only the line items, but all of the cart information. And here we can see that we have all of these line items. So what it would make sense to do over here is that when we get back this cart from this API, is to run a function which completely refreshes our entire cart based on this new cart information that we got back. Okay, and that way we'll make sure that our UI is displaying the most updated version of our cart. So that's what we're going to hop in and set up to do now. Okay, so before we make any additional changes and add the functionality for our other subtract quantity button and the input, I want to create a function which is essentially a render function. And what a render function will do is it will completely re-render the UI. So for now, it'll just be our cart, or our line items, but later on, it will also be all of the other information in the cart, such as the subtotal and the discounts, etc., based on any change that's made inside of the cart. And this function is going to work quite similarly to the populate cart items function. So I'm going to use that as the basis for this function, but there are going to be some changes that we're going to make to it. So let me go ahead and copy over our populate cart items function, and I'm going to paste it right underneath again. And I'm going to change the name over here to be render cart. Okay, so this is a function that re-renders the cart whenever there's an update, and this function is going to take a parameter which is going to be the cart. Okay, so that means we don't need this line in here which gets the cart. We don't need to log it over here, and we don't need to update the currency symbol because we already did that when we ran the first function over here. Okay, populate cart items, which we're still going to be leaving as is. And I'm saying that we're erasing it now, but that is something I might change my mind about later, but that's my right. So I'm going to erase that. And another critical difference that we're going to need to make is that we're going to, instead of running on item ready here for the repeater, we're going to be running for each item. And that's because this function is going to be making changes to the repeater and not going to be setting up the default data that's displayed in the repeater when the repeater loads for the first time. Another thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove this event listener. I'm going to remove essentially here what we just set up for the add quantity button. And that's because I don't want to set up these event listeners multiple times for each button. So if I leave this in here, essentially what's going to happen is that every time we make an update to our cart, we're going to be attaching a new event listener to these buttons. But these event listeners are going to be staying the same no matter what. No matter what data is actually inside our cart, the behavior of the buttons is going to be the same. And that's why I don't need this over here. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that as well. And we're not going to be adding any additional event listeners over there. So now that we have our render cart function, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call that here after we get back our updated line items, which is essentially our cart. So let me go ahead and change the language here just so it matches what's actually happening. So I'm going to go over here to this, and I'm going to change this to say cart, and I'm going to change it over here as well inside of our console log. So this is going to be cart and cart, and I'm going to call over here underneath the render cart function and pass in this new cart. Okay, and let me just go ahead and make that small change to the backend as well. So here, inside of our change item quantity function, this I'm going to call instead updated cart and updated cart. Okay, just to make sure that our language is consistent and actually matches what that object is. Otherwise, we're bound to confuse ourselves when we write more code in the future. So now that we have that all updated, I'm going to go ahead and publish this change. And what I'm going to be looking out for is to see if our UI changes as we expect once we update one of the line item quantities. So for example, if I add something to, let me just wait for this to load, right? So if I add a product over here, okay, if I add one item to the quantity, I expect this 4 to update to be 5 to reflect that change. And I also expect this total price to update to reflect that change. So let's go ahead and see if that works. I'm going to go ahead and click the plus button. And there's an error, so let's see. The data parameter that is passed to a data method cannot be, it might be type of array. Okay, so let me see where I made a mistake. It looks like it should be over here. So this, I think, got, this here got like a value of null or something else. Let's see, this we did get cart, render cart. We passed in cart over here. Let's take a look. So, okay, so here I think the fact that this cart has a property that's called cart, and that's the actual cart. So here, no biggie, no biggie, it happens, bugs happen. So here, this updated cart, essentially what we want to do, so there's two ways that I could fix this. Either I could do it on the front end or on the back end. I prefer to do it, I'll do it here on the front end, and maybe I'll change my mind later, but for now I'll do it here on the front end. So essentially I just need to extract the cart property like this. Okay, that's all I need to do over here. And hit publish. And go ahead and hit refresh. And I'm going to refresh just one more time just to make sure. Awesome. So now let's try doing that again. So I'm going to hit the button here to increment. And it didn't do what I expected. So we did get back here this cart over here. We did get back the line items. And we see that the quantity here is updated. So let's try and think why this for each item didn't run. And I think that the problem is that here we're assigning the data after the for each item, but this data actually needs to be assigned before the for each item. So let's try changing that around. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this right over here and put that right before the for each item. Okay, so it's just a slight difference in the logic of how on item ready works and for each item works. So let me go ahead and publish that. And we're going to refresh. And we're going to refresh one more time just for good measure. And let's try that one more time. So I'm going to increment this again by 1. And now you see that it updated. So it updated here to 7 and to 140. And I can do it here as well. And it's 2 and 240 and 6 and 510. Okay, so this is working now as expected. And later on, I might choose to add like maybe like some kind of visual loader or something that runs, because now it was quite quick. I was actually pleasantly surprised by how quick it updated. But if somebody has a slower network or something like that, we might want to show them that something's happening as the data is being updated so they don't freak out about their cart. Okay, so now that we've done the add button, what we're going to do is we're going to deal with the subtract button and with the manual changing of quantity. So since we have this logic already built out for the add quantity button, setting up the subtract quantity button and the actual change of the input is not going to be very hard. So initially I'm going to do it by copying and pasting this code, but then I'm going to extract it to one singular function and try and make our code a little more dry or do not repeat yourself. Okay, so let's go ahead and copy this over twice. And the reason I'm doing it like this initially is because I like to see the logic in full before I decide how I want to simplify my code and make it more efficient. So here, in addition to the add quantity button, we're going to have here the sub quantity button. And this is essentially going to do the same exact thing, except it's going to subtract 1. Okay? That's going to be over here. And we need to make a note to ourselves that we can't let the user subtract for it to be 0. Okay, so that's something that we're going to want to remember as we're making our code a little more efficient. So in addition to the sub quantity button, we're also going to want to have the add quantity button, the quantity input over here. So that's going to be here quantity input. And this is not going to be on click, but it's going to be on change. And instead of the updated quantity being quantity plus 1, the updated quantity is going to be whatever the value is of quantity input. So here we're not going to need to get the quantity from item data. So this we don't need right over here. And here for the updated quantity, it's essentially going to be, here we're going to have an event, and this is going to be event.target.value. Okay, so those are the three functions as they should be. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to publish this and just run some tests and make sure that my logic is somewhat working. And then once we do that, we're going to think about how we can make this code more efficient by extracting one singular function which handles most of what's going on over here. So let me head back over here to the live site. Going to give it 2 refreshes. And now let's test it out. So let me try removing a line item here. Awesome, so that seems to be working. Let me try again. Okay, it worked once. It worked once. Let me try up here. Okay, so that worked once. Let me try again. Okay, so for some reason the subtract is only working once. Let me try the quantity change. Whoops. Okay, so this is important because I do want to see what errors we're getting. So let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and go into our logs. Open up the log. And let's try this again. Okay, interesting. So I am getting the cart back here. Let's see what we're getting here in line item. So we're getting, yeah, quantity 5. Let's try subtracting again. And line items. Yeah, so the quantity seems to be staying 5. I don't have any errors here in the logs. Let's try changing the quantity manually. So let's say here, let's say if I change it to 3. Yeah, so that did change it. Okay, so you saw that the price updated there, so that was working. Let me change this 4, let's say. Awesome, so that is working, but for some reason the subtract only works once. So let me head into the code and try and peek around there and see why that might be happening, and I'll be back with you in a moment. Okay, so I'm back after some debugging, and I think that I've identified the issue. And the issue is that when we set up this add quantity button, so we're defining the quantity over here to be the quantity that belongs to the item data. Okay? And this quantity is always going to be the same. Okay, so essentially, since we're not running this on-click event listener in the updated for item ready, okay, that we have, for each item in the render cart function. So essentially what's happening is that every time that we click on the add quantity button, this quantity is always the initial quantity that the repeater started off with. Okay, it's not the updated quantity in the for each item. And there's probably more than one solution to this, like most problems. I don't want to solve it by running the event listeners again in the for each item. So instead, what I'm going to go with is I'm going to, instead of using the item data from within the repeater, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to extract the cart as a global variable and tap directly into the cart data each time that I want to make one of these changes. So let's go ahead and make that change. So that means that over here, when we populate the cart items, okay, so instead of defining cart over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to define it up here as a global variable. Okay, so I'm going to say let cart. And then over here, okay, we're just going to say that cart equals to get cart. Okay, that's one first step. And later on here, when we essentially make this update here from change item quantity over here. So what I'm going to do is here, instead of saying const cart equals whatever the changed cart is, I'm going to also here say that cart equals to await change item quantity. And now I have to go back and actually change it in the backend so that here we're getting the cart and not that kind of parent object with the cart inside as a property. So let's go ahead and change that here in the cart.js. So here we're going to have the updated cart. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to return updated cart.cart. Okay, so we're returning the actual cart from the backend file. Not a very tough change. And here, I'm just going to make that same change that I made over here in the rest of the sub quantity button and quantity input. So I'm going to go over here and make that change. And I'm going to make that same change over here. Okay, so now that we've made those changes, there's still one more thing that we need to do. And that is that instead of using item data over here, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to use the actual cart line item. So in order to do that, we're going to have to get a specific line item from the cart. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function down here. And I'm going to call it function get line item. And essentially this is going to take a line item ID. And then we're going to say that const, or we could do here essentially return cart dot line items dot filter. And we're going to filter it so that the item.id equals to line item ID, and we'll return the only item here that should be in the array. Okay, so essentially it's a filter that will take all the line items of the cart and find the one that matches the ID that we pass in as a parameter to the function. And I'm doing this because we're probably going to need this to get this line item several times throughout our code, and I don't want to need to write all this every single time, but instead I'd rather have like a quick function that can do that for us. So now that we have this get line item function, what I'm going to do over here is, instead of saying that this here equals to item data, I'm going to say that this equals to get line item, and then here we're going to have the line item ID, which is item data.id. Okay, and I'm just going to copy over this change to the rest of the functions. So that's over here. And this is a great example of why it would be great if our code was efficient and we didn't have three functions that are pretty much identical, because now you can see that I need to make all these changes throughout the functions. But that's fine. Eventually, these are going to be one function. We've learned our lesson. So now that that is all updated, I'm going to publish and check and see if this actually solves the problem that we had. So let me go ahead and click publish. And I'm going to hit refresh. Make sure we're published. And I'll just refresh one more time for good measure. And let's see. So let me try and let's try removing over here. Okay, so it went down to 5. So we didn't completely break our code, which is already a good step. And let's see if now we manage to go down to 4. And we managed to go down to 4. Okay, and to 3, and to 2. And then we can go up as many as we want as well. Okay, so we essentially fixed that little bug that we had there in the code. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a separate function that's essentially going to facilitate all 3 of those event listeners and hopefully make our code a little more dry. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to attempt to make this code a little more dry, fingers crossed. And I'm going to do that by creating a new function over here. And let's call this function, let me zoom in here, and this is going to be an asynchronous function. And I'll call it update line item quantity. And before I think about what parameters this needs to take, let's think about what part of this code that we have over here is essentially reusable. So here we have a similar line of code between these two functions, but this third function doesn't share that line of code. So that's not something that we can necessarily put as is into our new function. The other thing that's also different between each of these functions is how it changes the quantity. So that's something unique to each one of these functions. What is the same between all of them is essentially this part, which gets the updated cart with the ID and the updated quantity, and then renders the cart again. So that's the first part that I can go ahead and extract over here. So I'm going to copy it over, and I'm going to put it right over here inside of my new, put it over here inside of my new updated function. And we see that we're missing some things here. So one thing that we're missing here is the item ID. So let me just add that in as a parameter. And we're also going to want to have the updated quantity. Okay, and we can change our code here a bit so that the ID is the item ID and the quantity here is the updated quantity. Okay, we don't need this console log anymore because we know that our code is basically working and we hope that it stays that way. And now essentially what we can do is we can call this function after we've made the changes to the quantity. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to grab this function right over here, and I'm going to replace all of this with that function. Okay, so we're going to update the line item quantity, and we're going to pass in the item ID, which is essentially this ID, and we're going to update and pass in the updated quantity. Okay, and we can do the same thing here for this function over here. Go ahead and format that, and we can do the same thing over here and format that. Okay, so that's already made our code a lot more efficient. And one last thing that I want to do is put in that protection that we talked about. And that's going to say here essentially that if the updated quantity is equal to, or is, let's say, smaller or equal to 0, then we're going to return. Okay, then we're not going to try and make any attempt at updating the quantity because no, if it's 0, if it's going to become 0 essentially by the change that we're going to make, then we're not going to make that change. Okay, so that's the last thing that I'm going to do here. And let's just publish this and run some tests just to make sure that that change didn't break anything. Awesome. Great. So let me just try making, yeah, so that's still working. That's still working. And let's change this, let's say to 2. That's still working. Okay, so our code is still working as expected. And the final thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be removing a product completely using this remove button. So let's head over and do that now. Okay, so in order to remove line items from the cart, we're going to be using this function right over here. So remove line items from current cart. And this is again part of current cart, which is part of Wix Ecom backend. And this again is imported from, uses the current cart import. So it should be relatively easy for us to set up in the backend. And the way that it functions is also very similar to the function that we set up for the updating of quantity. Just here, we don't need quantity, we just need the line item IDs in an array. Okay, so let's head to the editor and go to our cart JSW file. And here, under the change item quantity function, I'm going to create a new function. So export async function. And this is going to be remove item from cart. And this will just take here, again, a line item ID. And sorry, I don't know if you could see that. Line item ID here as a parameter. Okay. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to say const updated cart equals to await current cart dot remove items from current cart. And like before, we're going to be wrapping this in an array because that's what Wix expects to get here. And we're just going to pass in the line item ID that we are going to get from the front end. After that, what we're going to do is like before, we're just going to return our updated cart.cart. And now that we're done building the function, we can go ahead and import that on the front end. So let me copy over the name of the function, head to our custom cart page, and right over here up top, where we have the other imports from the same file, I'm going to add that one in as well. Okay, and now we just need to set up the event listener for that button. So let me go back here into our onItemReady function, and I'm going to select our button, so remove from cart button, and I'm going to say dot on click. And what we're going to do here is we're going to call our remove, what did I call it? Remove item from cart function. Okay, that's what we're going to call. And we're going to pass in the ID. So it's going to be item data.id. And these IDs don't have the same problem that we had earlier with the quantity because these IDs don't change. The quantity does change, but the IDs don't change. And that's why here we don't need to get these IDs from the cart itself, just if you were wondering. And once we call this function, so we're going to store the updated cart in a variable. So we'll say const cart equals to await remove item from cart. And then this needs to be an asynchronous function over here. Okay. And last but not least, what we're going to do is we're going to render our cart again. Okay, and this new rendered cart hopefully won't have that line item in it because we removed it from the cart. So we'll call render cart with cart, and let's zoom out. And I'm going to go ahead and publish this code. And let's refresh this page. Let me refresh one more time for good measure. Awesome. So let's go ahead and try and remove this item from the cart and see what happens. Boom. There we go. Our cart no longer has that item. So that was relatively easy compared to the quantity shifting, I feel. But we don't really want people to do that. So I don't know, you might even choose not to have that option inside of your cart. It's kind of like a balance between your interests and possibly the customer's interests. But that's up to you, and that's why we're customizing the cart. And with that, we're also going to wrap up for today. So just to do a recap, what we did is we set up the additional parts of the cart that we hadn't, sorry, of the line item repeater that we hadn't last time, which includes this currency over here, the currency symbol. It includes the different options here listed. It includes the quantity changing over here and the remove item from cart with this button over here. And now what I'm going to hop in and do is do our code review, where I go over all the code that we wrote today and just go over the logic and make sure that everything is clear so that you can hopefully implement it on your side as well. Okay, so this is the code review, and I'm going to go through the logic of the code as it's written at the moment and make sure that we all completely understand what we have and what the flow is. So today what we did is we added two new functions in the backend based on Wix APIs, and one of them changes the item quantity and the other removes item from the cart. And we also installed an npm package which assists us to convert the currency code into a currency symbol. So that's the additions that we have to our imports up here on top. In addition, we declared two new global variables. One is a global variable that stores all of the data about our cart and gets updated whenever we make changes to the cart. And another one is the currency symbol, which is not really included individually as a variable inside of the cart. So that's what we declared over here. In terms of our onReady function, there's no change, so we're still calling populate cart items. And inside of the populate cart items function, we did make several changes. So one is that we don't declare cart as a variable here, we just assign the value that we get back from getCart to the global variable. And otherwise, we also extract the symbol from the currency and store that in the global variable as well. In addition, we made several changes to the onItemReady function over here. Okay, so we made several changes over here, and that's specifically adding these four callback functions here for the add quantity button, the subtract quantity button, and the quantity input, and the remove from cart button. Where what we did is essentially when you click one of these buttons, what happens is we get the ID of that specific item, we get the quantity, then we make a specific alteration to the quantity based on which button we clicked or which input we were using. And then we call another function that we built, which is update line item quantity. And that's this function down over here. And this function we wrote to just be a little more dry with our code. And essentially what it does is it validates and sees if we're not trying to accidentally make our quantity less than 1, which wouldn't be possible. And then it calls the backend function that we built with the data structure that needs to be provided to that backend function. Then, last but not least, we re-render the cart using the updated cart that we get back from the Wix API. This render cart function is a new function that we built based on the populate items function. And what this does essentially is it gets the cart passed into it from somewhere. So somewhere passes in an updated cart object, and then using that, it extracts the line items, assigns it to the repeater, and then does a for each item for the repeater to repopulate the data and display the most updated data. And down here, eventually we're also going to have a few more things that need to be re-rendered on the screen, such as all of the totals and tax, etc. So that's also going to go into this function at a later point. Another function that we wrote today is a function that assists us in converting the product options into text. And the way that we do that is that we extract the options from a specific product, and then we create an array with the keys of that specific object and loop through those keys in order to set up each individual text line, attaching it to this options text variable. Then we return the options text variable so that we can use it later in our code and assign it to the specific element that is displaying those options. Okay, so those are the key changes that we made in our code in this part of the tutorial. I hope that you found it informative and maybe enjoyable. And if you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments or you want to share your project, please do so in the comments below. And if you want to see the rest of this series and other cool videos about Wix, and Velo, please don't hesitate to subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time.